NBA offseason grades. The Eastern Conference. Starting off with the Atlanta Hawks, they had a busy offseason. So starting off with the draft, they picked A.J. Griffin at 16 and Tyrese Martin at 51. Griffin was a really solid pick because he was the consensus 9th best prospect. Then in terms of new players, they brought in DeJounte Murray, all-star point guard from the San Antonio Spurs. They sent out a ton of draft picks to get him. He will undoubtedly make the Hawks better in the short term. His defense is perfect alongside Trae Young in the backcourt, and his transition offense should help as well, and also having an additional ball handler when Trae's not on the court, all good stuff for the Hawks in the short term. But did they give up too many picks to get DeJounte, and is he optimized next to another ball-dominant player in Trae? That remains to be seen. They also acquired Justin Holiday, Mo Harkless, Aaron Holiday, and Frank Kaminsky. They did not re-sign or extend anybody, and players they lost: Danilo Gallinari, part of the DeJounte Murray trade; Kevin Huerter, who they traded to the Sacramento Kings, which was a bit of a head-scratcher because he is a young, talented player, and this is a young, talented team. They did get a first-round pick back for him, but nonetheless, I would have prioritized keeping Huerter if I was the Hawks. They also lost DeLon Wright, Gorky Jane, Kevin Knox, and Sharif Cooper. Ultimately, we're going with a B for the Hawks. They will undoubtedly be better in the short term, but ultimately they might have given up on a little bit too much going forwards. Next up is the Boston Celtics, another team that had a busy offseason. So first off, with the draft, they picked J.D. Davidson at 53, not much value there. But the veterans they acquired were big moves. They brought in Malcolm Brogdon, Danilo Gallinari, Mfiondu Kabengele, Bruno Caboclo, and Noah Vonleh. Brogdon is a huge addition for the Celtics, an already deep team adding another capable, defensive-minded, ball-handling point guard, probably coming off the bench behind Marcus Smart. Nonetheless, a very valuable addition. However, there's always injury concerns with Brogdon, and Gallinari is in the same boat, and he actually is already injured. So while both of those additions were fantastic in theory for the Celtics, I'm a little bit worried that they might not make as big of an impact as some are predicting due to availability. They also retained Luke Kornet and Sam Hauser, and they lost Daniel Tice, Aaron Nesmith, Nick Stauskas, Jawan Morgan, and Malik Fitz. So it's going to be an A- for the Celtics. They really knocked it out of the park with their acquisitions, but I didn't love the draft, and I'm a little bit worried about the injury concerns with the two main guys that they brought in. Alright, moving on to the Brooklyn Nets, yet another team who had an eventful offseason. So starting off with the draft, they actually didn't have any picks, but they scooped up an undrafted player, Alondes Williams, who was actually projected as the 71st best prospect. They also acquired TJ Warren, who hasn't seen the court in over 2 years, but he was definitely a talented player when he was active, especially in the bubble, and they also got Royce O'Neal, the defensive stalwart from the Utah Jazz. They got Edmund Sumner as well. They re-signed or extended Nick Claxton, Kessler Edwards, and Patty Mills, and they lost out on Andre Drummond, Bruce Brown, and Goran Dragic. So if that's all that happened for the Nets, it would have been a bit of a lackluster offseason. But what they didn't do was just as impactful as what they did do. They did not trade Kevin Durant or Kyrie Irving when there were many calls to do so. Trading either one of those guys for pennies on the dollar when their trade value was at their lowest would have been a mistake, undoubtedly. Now, will everything be copacetic going forwards in Brooklyn? Not a chance. But keeping those guys, at least for now, was definitely the right move. So we're going with a B+ for the Brooklyn Nets. Next up, we have the Charlotte Hornets, who had a very quiet and disappointing offseason. At the draft, they picked Mark Williams at 15 and Bryce McGowens at 40. McGowens might have been the best thing that the Hornets did all offseason, as he was the projected 32nd best prospect. Williams was the 15th best prospect, so both decent picks, especially McGowens. They did not, however, acquire anybody else, and they only re-signed or extended Cody Martin, who was a solid player, but nonetheless, the Hornets really needed to do more, as they are at risk of floundering in the mediocre zone of the Eastern Conference. But of course, the worst part of their offseason was something that was entirely out of their hands. That was the loss of their second best player, Miles Bridges, to some pretty heinous domestic violence charges. He will almost certainly be convicted and suspended heavily by the league, so he is pretty much out of their plans going forwards. So all in all, pretty disappointing offseason for Charlotte. Even though it wasn't really their fault, the Hornets are going to get a D for their offseason. Next up, we can move on to the Chicago Bulls, who also had a slightly lackluster offseason, but there was definitely some bright spots for them. So in the draft, they picked Dalen Terry at 18, Justin Lewis was an undrafted player, but he was projected to go 42nd, and Javon Freeman was undrafted as well. So I really liked the value they got with the undrafted player Justin Lewis. They also acquired veterans Andre Drummond and Goran Dragic. both of whom should help shore up the depth issues that the Bulls were facing last season with all the injuries that they had. The biggest move that the Bulls did was re-signing their star guard Zach LaVine to a huge new $215 million contract, and they also re-signed Derrick Jones Jr., and then they lost out on Troy Brown Jr. So ultimately we're going to go with a B- for the Bulls. Didn't do anything revolutionary. Re-signing LaVine was the biggest move, obviously, but Drummond and Dragic, both solid acquisitions, and then the Justin Lewis pick was solid as well. Moving on, we have the Cleveland Cavaliers, who, like the Hawks and Celtics, had a hugely consequential offseason. First off, in the draft, they picked Isaiah Mobley, brother of Evan Mobley, with the 49th pick, although he was projected as the 83rd best prospect, so I didn't like that. However, they brought in all-star guard Donovan Mitchell from the Utah Jazz. They sent out a ton of draft picks to get him. So was it an overpay? Perhaps, maybe a little bit, but he is a star player nonetheless, and he will absolutely vault the Cavaliers into the upper echelon of the Eastern Conference, which is something they were flirting with last season before injuries took their toll. They also brought Ricky Rubio back, and they acquired Robin Lopez and Raul Neto, two solid veterans. Then they brought back Darius Garland and RJ Nembhard. Garland was a no-brainer. He made his first All-Star game last season, and now the tantalizing pairing alongside Donovan Mitchell make them immediately one of the best backcourts in the NBA. In terms of players they lost, it was Colin Sexton, Lauri Markkanen, Ochai Agbaji, and Moses Brown, most of whom went to the Utah Jazz in the Donovan Mitchell deal. So it's going to be an A for the Cleveland Cavaliers. The only reason it's not an A+ is the Isaiah Mobley pick, which was a bit foolish in my opinion, but nonetheless, this talented young core of Darius Garland, Donovan Mitchell in the backcourt, and Evan Mobley, Jarrett Allen in the frontcourt is undoubtedly one of the best young cores in the NBA going forwards. Next up, we have the Detroit Pistons, who also had a really solid offseason, especially for a rebuilding team. So at the draft, they made the most impactful moves, picking up Jaden Ivey with the 5th pick. He was the consensus 4th pick, so that was a good one. Then they got Jalen Duren with the 13th pick. That was also fantastic, as he was the 11th projected player. They got Gabriel Procida at 36, and they acquired Alec Burks, Nerlens Noel, Kemba Walker, and Kevin Knox. And then they re-signed Marvin Bagley, and they lost Jeremy Grant and Carson Edwards. Okay, so just to get some of the machinations straight here, the Jeremy Grant trade with the Portland Trailblazers netted them a first-round pick, so that was something that needed to happen eventually as this team is rebuilding and moving towards a young core. But then they used that pick to trade with the Knicks and move up in the draft, so that's how they got all the way up to the 13th spot, where they were able to take the talented young big man Duren. So a fantastic series of moves for Detroit. We're going to give them a B+ for their troubles. I didn't really like the Marvin Bagley extension or the Gabriel Procida pick, and Duren and Ivey were kind of no-brainers at the positions that they were drafted. So all things considered, the Pistons continue to move in a positive direction, and this offseason was no exception. Moving on to the Indiana Pacers. They had one of the more lackluster off seasons like the Charlotte Hornets. At the draft, they picked Benedict Mathurin with the 6th pick. He was the consensus 7th best prospect, so that was a fine pick. Andrew Nembhard was picked at 31, although he was projected to go 44, but Kendall Brown was picked 48, and he was projected to go 23, so kind of a flip-flop there. And then Hugo Besson, they got him with the 58th pick. So all things considered, I liked the players that the Pacers brought in at the draft. They also traded their veteran point guard Malcolm Brogdon to the Celtics, which we already touched on. They acquired Daniel Tice and Aaron Nesmith in the process, and then they re-signed Jalen Smith, and they also lost Ricky Rubio, TJ Warren, and Dwayne Washington Jr., although none of those guys were really in their long-term plans. So we're going with a C+ for the Pacers. That might sound a little bit harsh due to the positive feelings I have towards the draft, but the real problem is what the Pacers didn't do. They still have Miles Turner, Buddy Hield on the roster, veteran guys who are not exactly helping this rebuild effort that the Pacers should be undertaking. Despite having a talented young guy already in Tyrese Halliburton, they really need more, and those veterans are only going to be slowing that process down. So they really need to make a move. They still have time to do so. We'll see what happens by the time the season starts or by the trade deadline. Okay, moving on now to the Miami Heat, and it's another lackluster offseason. At the draft, they picked Nikola Jovic at 27, despite the fact that he was the 29th best prospect. And then they picked up 4 undrafted players, as they typically do: Jamari Bouyeya, Orlando Robinson, Darius Days, and Jamal Cain, several of whom were top 100 prospects coming into the draft. They did not acquire anybody else, though. They did re-sign or extend Victor Oladipo, Caleb Martin, Dwayne Dedmon, and Marcus Garrett, and they lost PJ Tucker. So this might sound harsh, but we're going with a straight D for the Miami Heat. I hated the fact that they lost PJ Tucker. He was integral to their defense. I liked the Caleb Martin re-signing, but Victor Oladipo is a bit washed at this point, and they didn't get anybody else in. There's also a little bit of an acrimonious situation with Tyler Hero and Pat Riley, and then I was very underwhelmed by their draft as well. Jovic was not worth a 27th pick. So all things considered, I think the Heat really missed an opportunity here with this offseason, as Jimmy Butler is getting up there in age, as is Kyle Lowry, and they might be at risk of falling out of contention here going forwards with all the other teams in the Eastern Conference loading up. Okay, next up we have the Milwaukee Bucks, another elite Eastern Conference team who had a bit of an underwhelming offseason, although to a slightly lesser degree than the Miami Heat. So the Bucks at the draft picked Marjon Beauchamp with the 24th pick. He was only projected as the 30th best prospect, though, and then they picked up undrafted player AJ Green. They acquired veteran swingman Joe Ingles. He's coming off of a significant injury absence, and they doled out $6.5 million for him, so that was a pretty big gamble. And then they re-signed or extended a ton of guys: Pat Connaughton, Bobby Portis, Wesley Matthews, Javon Carter, Serge Ibaka, Luka Vildoza, and Lindo Wigginton. They lost Rajon Tucker, so all things considered, we're going to go with a C+ for the Milwaukee Bucks. They didn't really do that much to improve their chances. Granted, when you're one of the best teams in the league, you don't really have to. But with that being said, it would certainly be nice if they would have at least done a little bit more than they did. They kind of just got older. Ingles, Matthews, Ibaka, these guys are all well into their 30s. And then I didn't really like their draft either, so they're still going to be one of the best teams in the league, but they could have done more. Okay, next up we have the New York Knicks. And like their crosstown rivals, the Nets, they got more attention for what they didn't do than what they did do. But I think that's a little bit unfair. So at the draft, they got Trevor Keels with the 42nd pick. He was the projected 34th best prospect, so that's a solid pickup. They also had 2 noteworthy acquisitions: Jalen Brunson and Isaiah Hartenstein. Now, Brunson got much more press. He is a solid point guard, formerly with the Dallas Mavericks. He was the second best player on a team that made it all the way to the Western Conference Finals. So frankly, I think it was gross mismanagement by the Mavericks to let him go to the Knicks, and they will certainly be better with him at the helm in the backcourt. And then Hartenstein was low-key the best backup big man in the NBA last season, so he is a solid addition as well. They re-signed or extended Mitchell Robinson and Jericho Sims, and then they lost Kemba Walker, Alec Burks, Nerlens Noel, and Taj Gibson, most of whom they sent to the Detroit Pistons. So it's going to be a B+ for the Knicks. Yes, they did lose out on Donovan Mitchell, and yes, they did trade back in the draft, but I think both of those moves were defensible. They didn't rush into anything, as has often been the case with the Knicks over the past several years, and they just definitely got better with the Jalen Brunson acquisition. So I think all things considered, this was a solid offseason for the Knicks. Next up, we're moving to the Orlando Magic. Now, this grade might be a little bit controversial, and it all just comes down to what your opinion of their number 1 pick, Paolo Banchero, was. That's who they picked with their first pick in the draft. It was a bit of an unfortunate time to get the number 1 pick, because this was generally seen as a slightly less talented draft as the one before or the one coming up. So they picked Banchero, even though he was the consensus 3rd best pick coming into the draft. I don't think he's going to be a terrible player by any means, but I just think there was a bit more upside with Chet and Jabari Smith. He'll definitely be a solid scorer, but the defense is questionable, and so ultimately I'm just not sure if he was the right pick there at number 1. They also selected Caleb Houston at 32, and Drake Jeffries was an undrafted rookie that they picked up. They also acquired a couple of guys: Xavier Simpson, Kevin Harris, and Simi Shitu, and then they re-signed or extended Gary Harris, Mo Bamba, Bol Bol, and Admiral Schofield. Then Robin Lopez and Ignas Brazdeikis moved on. So ultimately, we're going with a C- for the Orlando Magic. And again, this all just comes down to Paolo Banchero. If you think he has superstar upside, then this was obviously a fantastic offseason. But if you don't, like me, and you think his upside is a little bit limited and a little bit lower than Chet and Jabari, then this was not so great. And that's why we're going with the C-. All right, moving on to the Philadelphia 76ers. This was a fantastic offseason for Philly. So first, at the draft, they did not have any picks, but they still made the most of it as they picked up two undrafted players, Michael Foster and Julian Champagnie, who were both projected to go in the top 60. Foster was the 49th best prospect and Champagnie was 57th. So really good stuff there. And then they also acquired four solid veterans, PJ Tucker, DeAnthony Melton, Daniel House, and Trevelyan Queen. Now, Melton was a trade with the Memphis Grizzlies, but they really didn't give up much to get him, and he's a really solid backup 3-and-D wing, supplementing their rotation as another option kind of in the vein of Matisse Thybulle. And then Tucker, despite his age, he is still producing at an elite level, hitting those corner threes and providing some tenacious defense. He'll probably fit right into the starting lineup alongside Joel Embiid and Tobias Harris for a new-look front court. And then they also re-signed James Harden. That was a big move as well, obviously. They lost Danny Green, DeAndre Jordan, and Miles Powell. So we're going to go with a straight A for the Philadelphia 76ers. I loved the fact that they got those guys at the draft. I loved all the defensive-minded players that they brought in, and the re-signing of James Harden, well, it remains to be seen how that's going to turn out, but they kind of had to do it, and they at least got him on a discount. So it's going to be a straight A for the 76ers, another solid offseason for Daryl Morey. Okay, two teams left in the Eastern Conference. We have the Toronto Raptors. They had a bit of an underwhelming offseason, in my opinion. At the draft, they selected Christian Koloko with the 33rd pick, and Ron Harper Jr., Gabe Brown were both undrafted players who they scooped. Now, Harper Jr. was this consensus 65th best prospect, so that was solid, but they didn't get much value with the Koloko pick. They did acquire several veterans, Otto Porter Jr., Juancho Hernan-Gomez, who just had a fantastic Eurobasket. They also got DJ Wilson and Jeff Doughton. They re-signed or extended Chris Boucher, Thaddeus Young, and Justin Champagnie. And then they didn't really lose anybody. So it's going to be a C+ for the Raptors. That might sound a bit harsh, but I was just a little bit underwhelmed. I didn't really like the draft. None of the guys that they brought in are life-changing. Otto Porter and Juancho should be solid additions to the super switchable and positionless roster that Masai Ujiri has been building, but I was just a little bit underwhelmed. Granted, they still have the flexibility going forwards to make a big move, but at the moment at least, barring a huge developmental season again from the Rookie of the Year Scotty Barnes, it feels like the Raps are just sort of in a holding pattern. They're still really good, but they're not quite in the upper echelon of contenders in the Eastern Conference. Okay, and finally, the last team in the Eastern Conference, the Washington Wizards. And unfortunately, they had, in my opinion, the worst offseason of any team in the conference. So, what did they do? At the draft, they picked Johnny Davis with the 10th pick. He was the projected 12th best prospect, and in my humble opinion, he should have been even lower than that. They also made a bit of an odd trade with the Denver Nuggets where they sent out Kentavious Caldwell-Pope and Ish Smith, acquiring Will Barton and Monty Morris. Frankly, out of all four of those players, I like KCP the best. Granted, he scores less than Barton and Morris, but his defense is by far the best. So I don't really love that trade for the Wizards. They also acquired DeLon Wright, Taj Gibson, and Makur Maker. In terms of re-signings and extensions, this was the big one. They re-signed Anthony Gill, but they also re-signed Bradley Beal, their star player. Now, in a vacuum, that would be fine. But this team has been so directionless and rudderless for so many years. They are just the definition right now of the treadmill of mediocrity. And this max contract for Bradley Beal, $251 million over the next 5 years, is perfectly emblematic of that treadmill of mediocrity and also ensures that they'll stay on it for quite some time because not only did they give him the max contract, but they also gave him a no-trade clause, something which was totally unnecessary and ridiculous, especially considering that he has repeated time and time again that he wants to be in Washington. So losing all of that leverage on a huge percentage of your salary cap moving forward was a terrible move. The Johnny Davis pick was terrible, and then they also lost Thomas Bryant, Hall Neto, Thomas Adoransky, and Cassius Winston. So we're going with a D- for the Wizards, and I think frankly that's being a bit charitable. It could have been an F, but we decided to bump it up a little bit because the Monty Morris and Will Barton acquisition will make them a little bit better offensively, but nonetheless, really disappointing stuff for the Washington Wizards.